Is it, do you suppose, that a seemingly well-adjusted child can suddenly fear that there's a monster in the closet or be afraid of the dark? Well, to children, these are very real fears, but parents can certainly deal with them in a constructive way. So says Dr. Bob Brooks, who is from McLean Hospital, and it's always a pleasure to see you, Bob. And I think this is a subject that definitely needs attention because kids really do have fears, don't they?
Oh, sure. Even when Jim Haller said he never had any, I think that's because he's a little crazy. Most normal kids have fears, and they actually serve a very adaptive purpose because by having fears, kids learn how to master their environment. It develops their self-esteem. And they also get help from their parents in mastering their environment. And they learn what's real and what's not real. So as children have fears, it gives them many opportunities to look at the world around them and to really learn about their imagination and how to conquer different kinds of fears.
So it's all right, providing it doesn't become a real phobia.
Well, if it becomes a phobia, and what we mean by a phobia is when the fear becomes so intense and so persistent, it would be like if a child was afraid of a dog. If they went out and were fine, but if a dog came within 100 yards, they got a little afraid, then it's more of a fear. But if that same child spent the whole day worrying about dogs, sitting in a classroom, not being able to concentrate, not being able to go out of the house sometimes because they were afraid of dogs, then already it's pathological or it's too intense. And that child typically would need some help.
All right, now let's go back to something you said about parents really being able to help a child become more well-adjusted through these fears. How?
Well, I think, first of all, I was interested in the segment you did on the National Geographic with those scenes, and when you asked whether it was okay for kids to see the show, I think that parents serve as a certain reality for kids, so that if a child was seeing the scenes of one animal eating another animal, the parent would have a chance to talk to the child. What is that about? Or if a child says, there's a monster in my bed or a monster in my closet, the parent would have an opportunity to try to reassure the child, not to say, you're being silly, but basically to say, I know sometimes children have fears, but let's look around the room and you'll see there's really nothing here.
Is it all right to say to your child, too, you're saying and guide your child through all of this experience as a parent. Well, is it all right to share with your own child your own fears that you had when you were a child?
I think there's nothing wrong with it because some children think they are the only children in the world who have fears. And I think it's very useful once in a while to share with your child that you had fears. I remember when I was about 4 years old in our apartment, the way the outside light was, I was convinced for about 6 months that there was some kind of monster in the room.
Living on your wall.
Oh, I was convinced of it, and I would cover my, self under the blanket and just pray that it would disappear. Magically, by the time the sunlight came the next day, the monster was gone.
You thought he only lived in your room at night.
That's right.
I did the same thing. I thought there was a witch living in the woods behind us, and I used to cover my head, and that made the witch go away. Why is that?
Well, it's very interesting. When we cover our eyes as children or cover our heads, it's almost like we're denying there's anything else. So it's like putting, the monsters away. They can't come in. It's just almost like the peekaboo game. When a child goes like this and then uncovers their eyes, when they're covering their eyes, it's like the whole world has disappeared.
You were telling me, relating that there was a case yesterday. A woman called you. She had seen the promo for this, and she said, suddenly my 11-year-old daughter is experiencing fears.
Well, kids can experience fears at any time, really, and I've seen some kids when they're 4 or 5 and some when they're 10 or 11. There may be certain things they're experiencing in life at that particular point which triggers a fear. And sometimes it becomes very irrational. And the child even knows to some extent it's irrational, but they get very frightened. Like I remember one 10-year-old girl who all of a sudden became very frightened of dirt or anything. She wouldn't touch anything. And the parents were very perplexed. Well, I saw this girl in therapy, and what was very interesting, she had had a grandmother who died about a year before of cancer. And as she described it, she said, my grandmother's body got all full of dirt.
Oh.
And I think what happened was she then assumed that the same thing might happen to her. So she didn't want to touch anything. But in therapy, we were able to correct some of the distortions that she had.
But it brings us back to something we've discussed before. As a child, everything is so magnified. It's much larger than it is to us, and it's up to us as adults to understand that, right?
Oh, yeah, you really have to as adults. Too many adults try to poo-poo the kids' difficulties. Parents have to be very sensitive to the fact that kids will magnify things. I've had parents come into my office and say, I can't understand why my child has any fears. We have a loving home and we're very giving. What parents have to realize is that many fears are based on the child's imagination, not based on reality. That kids who are struggling with their own angry feelings as they're growing up will often see the world as being very angry. They can't tolerate their own angry feelings, so they, what we call in psychology, they project it out into the world. So rather than me having angry feelings toward my parents, it's that there are these monsters out there who really have the angry feelings. Oh, it is. And I tell parents, it's not that you've done anything wrong, but we have to then look for ways for the child to handle those angry feelings, because some parents, they're very well-meaning. They don't give kids as much an opportunity as they should to handle angry feelings or to show it. So if a child has no way of showing certain feelings, it could come out in the form of certain fears.
What if you have a child that you would think 10 or 11, that by then they have allied all of these fears? What happens if this child constantly every night says, I'm afraid to go upstairs and go to bed. When are you coming up to join me?
See, but you know, it's interesting. At 10 or 11, you sometimes see the reemergence of fears because a child is starting to enter into adolescence. And there are many changes which are going on in their lives, including physical changes. And sometimes earlier fears are reawakened then. And I think it's important for the parent, even with a 10 or 11-year-old, to be there, to basically say, you know, I know you're fearful, I'm here if you need any help, and to somehow encourage the child slowly to master the fears. And parents can do that.
I wonder if, as parents, we often don't have these great expectations, and we think as our child grows, they ought to be able to tolerate and handle every situation, and perhaps they're not ready for that, and we're too impatient.
We sometimes push our kids too much. I remember one father who came in about his 11-year-old son and said, I don't know why my son is so anxious. And as I spoke to the father, he said, the other day at the pool, I threw my son in the water because he couldn't swim. And I said, you threw him in the water? And he said, well, that's a good way for him to learn. I said, that was too much, too quickly. If you would have gone into the water with your son and slowly showed him how to do it, then he would have a way of mastering the kinds of fears. But the father was just too quickly throwing him in, and if anything, was increasing the anxiety or fear.
Does it help to sit down and really then talk to your child? Ask, can you draw fears out of a child as a parent?
Some can. You should be very open to trying to talk about fears with your child. But, you know, part of the problem is some kids do not want to communicate their fears. They think they're silly. I remember one family that called me about their 5-year-old son. They were ready to kill this kid. Every night, they said, he put up a big...
No wonder he was afraid.
Every night, he put up a big battle before going to sleep. And he would throw things all over the room, and it really was a bad scene. I said to them, does your child have any fears? And they said, he never shows any fears. I saw this boy in an evaluation, and I said to him in a displaced way, sort of, why do some kids worry about going to sleep? And he said, you know, some kids think you can die when you go to sleep. Oh. And then I asked him his dreams, and they had to do with being killed and monsters. My feeling was that the reason he acted up so much was because of how frightened he was. And what we did then is I told the parents to leave a nightlight on. I told the parents to spend a little time each night trying to reassure the child. And it was very interesting. The aggression then really subsided.
Maybe even sitting on the edge of the bed and having a conversation before a child goes to sleep about something pleasant. Would that help?
It can help a great deal.
How about this fear of separation from parent, Bob? You mentioned the peekaboo game as an infant. That's what you're teaching your child, that once he uncovers his eyes, you'll still be there.
That's right.
But how about fear in older children of being separated, a parent dying, or suddenly being left alone? Is that a real fear, even in a very well-adjusted family?
Yeah. Separation is probably one of the most basic fears, and it's not unique to childhood. There are many adults who I see where there are major fears around separation. And it's a kind of fear where parents really have to prepare the child. So the first time a child is left with a babysitter, hopefully the parent has introduced the babysitter beforehand and they've talked to the child. See, the more experience a child has with having a parent leave and yet come back a few hours later, the more assured the child is. Some kids, though, who have lost a parent through death, have a much more difficult time because the parent does not return. I've seen several adults in therapy who have had significant losses when they were children, who have major problems with separation later on, major fears of separation. Some don't want to get into any kind of intimate relationship because they're afraid you get into an intimate relationship and the person will leave you just as mother or father left you years ago. So some of these fears and issues continue throughout life. They just don't disappear when a child is 10 or 15. There are many adults out there who carry many fears with them.
You know, we almost brought a book with you. Maurice Sendak is, I think, a terrific author, and he has a book called Where the Wild Things Are that is the greatest explanation to your child of how a little boy stands up to these monsters in his room, and he does a lot of that kind of work. Those are good books to buy
I
children.
love that book. It was interesting because as I was preparing for this segment, I had it on my desk. And I was going to bring it in, and I saw the picture of it.
Yeah, we used
It's
the
a
pictures.
lovely book because it really shows, first of all, that where the wild ones are is the child's imagination. What's very nice about the book is that the child gains some control over the fears. One of the things I always tell parents is find ways or opportunities for the child to master the fears. If a child is afraid to take a bath, slowly have them turn on the water, slowly have them put one foot in. Find ways that you slowly
Don't
have
say
the
you're
child.
going to take a bath and that's it.
Oh,
Try
yeah.
to deal with it.
You see, if anything, what parents don't realize, if anything, that kind of approach where you must take a bath or you must go swimming or you've got to go to sleep, what that often does is to just increase the child's fears because they're not capable of handling it. But if you can take a slow approach, if you can slowly help the child, I've seen it at a beach, the child doesn't want to go into the water. And I have seen people throw their kids into the water, but I've seen other people slowly take their child right to the foot of the water, they put one foot in. That's a much better approach because then the child starts to feel, hey, I can master the
Yes.
fears.
Much more compassion.